So this is the Bible study for February 10th, 2021. It's John chapter 6, verses 16 through 24. And remember that you can download PDF copies of this Bible study so that you can follow along with us as I teach this. And hopefully, if you're watching this on Facebook or on our app, that it's only because you missed Bible study this week and wanted to make sure that you catch up, because I really hope that everybody's finding a way to connect with our Bible studies in person, where we can have discussion and feedback and really be the church and pour into one another's lives, and not just be consumers of Christian content, watching things that we hope help us grow, but miss out on true Christian discipleship and the life of the body of Christ, which requires interaction between the body of Christ, interaction between believers. And so we'd love for you to join us in person at one of our campuses, either at ABQ Central or Valley Church, or even on Wednesday nights. Raquel hosts a group in Edgewood. And we'd love for you to join us. You can also join us on Zoom from home or from anywhere. And we can connect you there if you haven't already connected. So the text for today says, when evening came, his disciples went down to the lake, where they got into a boat and set off across the lake for Capernaum. By now it was dark, and Jesus had not yet joined them. A strong wind was blowing, and the waters grew rough. When they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus approaching the boat, walking on the water, and they were frightened. But he said to them, "It is I, don't be afraid." Then they were willing to take him into the boat, and immediately the boat reached the shore where they were heading. The next day, the crowd that had stayed on the opposite shore of the lake realized that only one boat had been there, and that Jesus had not entered it with his disciples, but that they had gone away alone. Then some boats from Tiberias landed near the place where the people had eaten the bread after the Lord had given thanks. Once the crowd realized that neither Jesus nor his disciples were there, they got into the boats and went to Capernaum in search of Jesus. All right, so number one in our Bible study says what just happened in the previous text that we studied on Sunday, according to 6:1 through 15. So remember that if you were with us in our last Bible study, that Jesus fed the 5,000. And so that's what has just happened, and that's referenced in the middle of this text. And so this crowd that shows up is the crowd that was there when he fed the 5,000, and now he's gone. So when his disciples went and got in the boat, they didn't follow his disciples because Jesus stuck around, but he went up to pray, and they figured, well, he'll come back down. We're going to stay around here and wait till he comes back down. But then they realized he wasn't there. So we're going to talk about that and a little bit, but so they were looking for him, and they ended up joining him on the other side by the end of this text. And but they were looking for him, and they thought he had stayed. So Jesus sort of pulled the old switcheroo on them, and they knew the disciples left, but they didn't think Jesus had left because he went up to pray. And obviously, while he was praying, they ended up sleeping, and he snuck off while they were sleeping, probably, and got right past them. And now all they know is there's only one boat. The disciples took it, so Jesus had to still be here, but he wasn't. So when other boats arrived, they took those boats over there. But what had just happened was the feeding of the 5,000, when the crowd showed up and Jesus was trying to get away alone with his disciples. So number two says, what did the disciples do in verses 16 and 17? It says, when evening came, his disciples went down to the lake, where they got into a boat and set off across the lake for Capernaum. By now it was dark, and Jesus had not joined them. So A, they went down to the lake. B, they got into a boat and set off across the lake for Capernaum. Now this was a big lake, and we know that particularly because, well, see, I'm from the Midwest where there are some big lakes, where there are lakes that are over 50 miles long, and there are some here in the Southwest that are pretty long as well, but not in New Mexico. In New Mexico, generally you can see across the lake, and there's not that many lakes that allow speedboats that go that produce a wake. So because if you let that happen on too small a lake, it really gets out of hand really quick with the wakes and the waves, and it's no fun to be swimming in and things like that. Um, so I think a lot of times when we think of lake, we think of a lake that we could, if we're any kind of swimmer, could probably just swim across. But we find out that these disciples had been rowing quite a while by this time, trying to get across the lake, and the storm came up and they were having trouble getting across the lake. So this was no small lake. Um, it doesn't necessarily mean it was one of the Great Lakes type lakes, which is almost seems like an ocean, but certainly it was bigger than I think we're used to thinking of in terms of New Mexico. So number 3 says, where was Jesus? According to the end of verse 17. Verse 17 says, they got in the boat and set off across the lake for Capernaum, but by now it was dark and Jesus had not yet joined them. A strong wind was blowing and the waters grew rough. I read into verse 18, but it says, and Jesus had not yet joined them. Um, he was with them. No, that's not true. B, he had not joined them yet. That's right. He had not yet joined them. C, he was probably getting fitted for new skis. That's just a little joke there, since he ended up going across on the surface of the water, or praying. Now, um, obviously, that's not in verse 17, but if we cross reference this text with the stories in Matthew and Mark, in Matthew 14:23, it says, after he had dismissed them, he went up on a mountainside by himself to pray. Later that night, he was there alone, and the boat was already considerable distance from land, buffeted by the waves because the wind was against it. So Matthew tells us that he was up on the mountainside, praying. Mark also tells us that in Mark chapter 6 and verse 46, it says, after leaving them, he went up on a mountainside to pray. So John leaves that part out because that's not the story that he's telling. He's not really talking about what Jesus was doing, although I think it is good for us to know that Jesus sent his disciples on and Jesus stepped away and went someplace alone to pray. Um, Perhaps the disciples did not spend as much time praying, it seems, at least at this point. I think they did. Later on, they learned from Jesus, but they had a real problem all throughout Jesus' ministry and his care for them and his discipleship of them, because they were always falling asleep while Jesus was praying, and they didn't seem to have the urgency at this point in their faith that Jesus had. That changed. That we see that changed at the point on the day of Pentecost, and we see that changed moving forward into their ministry. But that's not the story that John's telling. So John's not trying to talk to us about how much Jesus prayed or how important that was to him. John wants to talk to us about the incident on the lake, which doesn't require us knowing that detail of where Jesus was. That being said, I think it's important that we know that, and Matthew and Mark shared that, so we're going to just talk about that for a moment here, and recognize that Jesus, um, after he had been with all these people, Jesus got back with the Lord because that was what was really important. Got back with his Father, because it's interesting how, um, when we're in ministry, when we're in the faith, it's interesting how easy it is to get distracted by all the people around you and lose track a little bit of the will of God. And so Jesus did not allow that to happen. So Jesus was quick to get alone with the Father. Number 4 says what happened while the disciples were in the boat on the lake, according to verse 18. It says a strong wind was blowing and the waters grew rough. Matthew and Mark talk about being buffeted by the waves, and it's the same thing. So a storm blew up, and if you've ever been out on a lake in a storm, first of all, they come up faster than you expect. And We've even been out in the middle of a lake in a storm, an unfamiliar lake in my parents' speedboat, and ended up not thinking it was going to be that bad, and it got bad enough that we had to kind of just put up the cover and hunker down and wait for it to go over, because the waves on a large lake can get so rough that it makes it very difficult to, first of all, even on a speedboat these days, it just bangs you to death, hitting the waves, boom, 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 if you try to go too fast. And if you don't put that much power into it, then you don't get anywhere because the waves push you back faster than you can go forward. And that was actually what was happening with the disciples, since they didn't have an engine, they didn't have a motorboat, they were rowing, and they were having trouble putting enough power into it to get anywhere. Um, and the waves were pushing them more than they were able to push the boat. So number 5 says, how far had they rowed when they saw Jesus approaching on the boat? A minute or so. I think it's good to have context. So this question is here for us to understand context, because if we're not looking at the lake they were on, if we don't understand the size of the lake, if we don't realize what they were really up against, it can be easy for us to think of this like it was a little pond, like we were out there on Fenton Lake or something like that, and not really understand um, that this is a lake that is substantial. It's a lake that's big enough that they were rowing across it because of how long it would take to go around it. And if there's boats, it's better to go across it, than you'll get there faster. And they left as night was falling, but some of these would suggest that it was early in the morning by the time they were still getting there. So they were rowing across this that was taking hours and hours to row across, because it would have taken even longer to walk around. And so how far had they rowed? It wasn't a minute or so. It's not like, Jesus prayed and he took a little half-hour prayer break and said, I'll be with you in a half hour, an hour or so. They had rowed a considerable distance. Matthew 14:24 tells us. In John here, it tells us they had been rowing for 3 to 4 miles. And perhaps they were, one of the things is halfway. So let me just go and cross-reference here in Matthew It says the boat was a considerable distance from land, buffeted by the waves with the wind against it, shortly before dawn. So I said by the time Jesus got there, it was early morning hours. That's where we might see this. So they had been rowing all night. Um, it says um, so they were rowing. Um, they'd rowed 3 or 4 miles, um, and they were probably not almost there. They were really not making headway. They were probably still barely halfway there, and they couldn't see land, and it just didn't seem like they were getting anywhere. Number 6 says, "How did the disciples respond when they saw Jesus?" Um, so it tells us that Jesus approached the boat there just before dawn, according to Matthew and Mark. And when he got there, instead of being excited and instead of being happy that he finally got there and where have you been and we needed you and here, jump on in, it says, and they were frightened. They didn't realize who it was. They thought perhaps it was a ghost or something. Well, let's just think about this. We've read through John, we've read through hopefully the other gospels, and we realize that there were not a lot of instances of even Jesus walking on the water. So it's not like they'd seen him do this before. Neat trick, Jesus. Thanks for doing it again. There was really no precedent for other people walking on the water um, prior to this. So um, this was not something where they would have saw him and they would have immediately thought, "Oh, Jesus has walked to us out on the water." And so I think we've heard the story so many times, many of us in the church, that we're not thinking about. We think, oh, those disciples, those silly disciples, they didn't know it was Jesus. They were afraid. And we kind of belittle them as if we would have recognized them right away. Well, of course we would have. We've read the story. They didn't get to read the story before. They hadn't heard since they were kids and saw it on flannel graph and saw video depictions of it in movies and TV shows. They had never heard of somebody walking on the water, and even Jesus had not been doing this as a regular pattern. So they were afraid. They saw a figure coming to them in the middle of a storm when they probably couldn't see very well in the middle of night. And they thought this must be some sort of a ghost because people don't walk on water. So they were frightened. But um, the reason I say this is because I want us to, the next question here is, how do you respond when you see Jesus in the midst of your problem? And I think it's easy for us to say, oh, the disciples should have known, because they saw Jesus, and they knew Jesus, and they should have known he was going to show up in the middle of whatever was going on there. But let me just say, first of all, the disciples, despite the fact that he had just fed 5,000 and he had been performing miracles, the disciples had never seen him do this particular miracle before. And they were in trouble, and they were way more focused on the trouble they were in and what kind of trouble with this phantom or figure, this um, ghost that was coming out to them on the water. What kind of trouble was this going to compound our situation? What next? And so we can belittle the disciples and talk about how they should have known, while at the same time, in the midst of our problem, where we're focused on our problem, and and our problem's real. The disciples' problem, that was a silly problem. It's probably a small lake. They were probably all worried for nothing. They should have known Jesus would be there. They've been walking with Jesus. They've seen his miracles. And so they should have known, but in the midst of our problems, we don't think I should have known. We think, no, I am legitimately concerned and I have a reason to be concerned about my problem, but the disciples were just being disciples just didn't have enough faith. And so I want us to, sort of cut that off, stop that, and let's start talking about the fact that the disciples didn't have any more reason to know that it was Jesus walking to them on the water than we have to know that it's Jesus showing up in maybe a way we didn't expect in the midst of our problems. In fact, I would say we have more history. We've spent, at least those of us who are adults and have been in the church for some time, have had more opportunity to see the miracles and the working of Jesus than the disciples had at this point in their faith. Okay, remember, if that the disciples at the time of Jesus' crucifixion had only been walking with Jesus for 3 years. And this is not yet at that time. And so this appears to be at a time when, for most of us, if we've been a Christian for 3 years, we have had more time to trust in God and see him work in our circumstances than those disciples had with Jesus. And so, and we've had more opportunities to see him work miracles in our lives. And so we have 2,000 years worth of miracles and God working in his church to point to, including the stories of what Jesus already did in their lives in the Gospels. We have all this time and all this evidence, so we should be more likely, more apt to see Jesus in our circumstances, in our situations, and yet we seem to do it less often. So we belittle the disciples and think that we have better reason because we didn't walk with Jesus. We weren't talking to him and face to face with him. But let me just say, we need to switch that around. The disciples had really good reasons not to expect that that was Jesus and to be frightened when they saw him and frightened of the situation. We have less excuse. And so the question is, how do you respond when you see Jesus in the midst of our problems? Now, Jesus might not show up in the middle of the night in the storm looking like a phantom walking on the water in our problems, but Jesus arranges circumstances and Jesus shows up in the middle of the situation. And we think, oh no, what kind of other problem is now piling on to the problems that I already have? And we do think that. So Jesus is bringing answers into the middle of our problems, and we think that it's just more bad circumstances, and we don't recognize it as Jesus, just like the disciples did not recognize Jesus. And then it says, well, number 8 says, how do you respond? Which is really the same question. So, how do we respond? The answer, I think, is we're afraid also. We're afraid of the circumstances we're in. We're afraid when Jesus shows up because we don't recognize him as Jesus. And we're hesitant to receive the hand of help that Jesus is about to give us because we're afraid. So number 9 says, what happened when Jesus spoke this? I'm sorry. I'm not very good at reading today. And number 8 doesn't say, how do you respond? Number 8 says, how did Jesus respond? Jesus responded by trying to squash their fears, by telling them, don't be afraid. It's I. And when Jesus said that, it says, then they were, and this is the scripture right here. Um, it says, then they were, verse 21, willing to take him into the boat, and immediately the boat reached the shore where they were heading. So let me just stop and say, so they were afraid, and when they were afraid, they were trying to get away from Jesus. When they were afraid, they were probably rowing harder to see if they could get away from this phantom that actually ended up being Jesus himself. But when Jesus spoke, do not be afraid, they were willing to take him into the boat. Now, let me just say this, that as long as we're afraid, and as long as we don't recognize Jesus as Jesus in our circumstances, we are often not willing to allow him into the boat. We're not willing to allow him into our circumstances and our situations. And the hand of help that he's reaching out to us, we are generally pushing away because we don't recognize it as Jesus. And this is the story of our lives before we come to Christ. Unfortunately, it's often the story of our lives even after we've come to Christ, because we don't recognize Jesus in our circumstances and our situations, and he scares us as much as the circumstances do. And so we are unwilling to take him into the boat. But when we are willing to take him into the boat, then as soon as he gets in the boat, it's amazing how much the circumstances that were turbulent before, the storm stops. We're all of a sudden we're at the other side. The storm's gone and we're at the other shore. And all we had to do was be willing to take him into the boat, but we were not willing because we are afraid of him as we were of our other circumstances, because we didn't recognize him as Jesus. And so we need to recognize Jesus in our circumstances. It says, number 10, how long does it take for you to overcome your fear and put your trust in Jesus? Do we recognize him? Do we overcome our fear and decide to trust him and invite him into the boat? And how long does that take when we're in difficult circumstances, when we're in the midst of the storm? How long does it take for us to allow Jesus into the boat, to be willing to take him into the boat? Because oftentimes how long that takes also determines how long it takes, how long we spend in the middle of the storm instead of on the other shore. Because as soon as we invite him in, the storm is gone and we're on the other shore. Number 10 says, how long does it take for, number 11, does it ever seem like Jesus waits a long time to get involved in our problems? So let's look at this and realize that Jesus was up on the mountainside praying while we were struggling through the night. That Jesus didn't walk out to them as soon as the storm happened, that actually they had been rowing for 3 or 4 miles, that they left around dark, and it was almost dawn. And why did he wait? This is the question we often ask in our lives. Why did he wait all night to come out to them? And in our situation, often it seems like Jesus, we say, well, yeah, maybe it takes long for me to recognize him and to stop being afraid of him. But how long did it take him to show up? How long did it take him to come out to me? And yes, it often feels like he spent way too long praying, and he seemed to be at peace, just like the other story while he was sleeping in the bottom of the boat. He seemed to be at peace while we were in turmoil. And why did he wait so long? And the question, why do you think this is? Why does he wait so long? And the truth is, um, I don't know the answer, and I'm not sure the answer is the same in every circumstance, and God knows his way. But let me just ask you to consider that it may be that the reason Jesus sometimes doesn't show up for some time is because if he was there every time and we never got into problems because he was always there right at the beginning, we might get complacent. We might begin to think that Jesus was going to protect us from every problem. We might stop even thinking about him in our lives and stop trusting in him when we did get into trouble because he just showed up and it didn't require any trust in him. Didn't require any belief that he was going to be there at some point. We need to be taught that even if the storm seems to go on for some time, that even if um, we don't really see Jesus in the midst of the storm and we can't find him, and it takes time for him to be there, that he will come, that he will be there. And we need to be ready for him and looking for him and ready to invite him into the boat. And we, if we're over and over protected from ever going through a storm, then when the storm happens, then we're convinced Jesus must not be there, and we wonder if he will come, and we begin to think that he will not. So he has to be able to show us that even in the midst of problems in our lives, that he will be there. Even when we don't see him, even when we wonder when he'll be there, he'll be there. Number 12 says, what does verse 21 say happened when Jesus got into the boat? A, the seas calmed. B, the boat had reached the shore they were heading, where they were heading. And it just seems like immediate. And we don't know um, if they were just offshore already and they were afraid and they had really almost gotten there, and when Jesus cleared the storm they were there, or if Jesus sort of teleported them, hovercrafted them, and all of a sudden they were there. We don't know exactly what was going on, but Jesus had it all under control. And when Jesus was there, all of a sudden they were able to see. The storm cleared and they were able to see that he had gotten them there safely, that he didn't abandon them, that no matter what had happened while they were in the storm, that he had not left them uncared for. And we need to see that in our lives as well. Sometimes in our lives, when he clears the storm, we'll realize we were already almost there, and he had cared for us all the way. Um, and sometimes it's him that has to open up the path for us to get there, and we weren't there. We were in the middle of the lake and it was trouble, but when he showed up, everything changed. um, so number 13 says, is it possible that sometimes God is watching over our situation the whole time, but we are afraid because we can't see the shore? Is it possible that God knows what's going on? I would say it's likely. It is. God knows what's going on. He hasn't abandoned you, even when you think you see you're in the midst of the storm. He hasn't left you, um, and um, he's watching over you. He'll make sure you get where you need to go. You got to trust him. And sometimes it's not until you trust him that you begin to see how close the shore is. And the storm clears, because the storm in our lives most often is an emotional storm. It's a mental storm. It's the challenges of life. Yes, there are challenges. There are challenges in life, but our biggest problem a lot of times is not the challenges themselves, but our emotional and mental turmoil and how we handle the challenges. And so sometimes that's the storm within that he needs to clear up. and the circumstances of our life can be handled, and they can probably be handled better than we're handling them. And it's amazing how much our turmoil within causes us to be blinded, to not see Jesus, to not see the shore. And as it turns out, God was watching over us all the time. And as soon as we trust in Him, we stop fearing and let Him into the boat. um, Everything seems different. Everything changes.